Hello, 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 greetings, salutations, konnichiwa, and every other form of green across this vast, marvelous multiverse. I am Matsu Quinox. This is Horace, and welcome back, my wonderful dear scholars, once again to the study. I love doing that. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to be back here once again. Congratulations on getting first, Kinshon. And hello to you. Hello there, Yulin20. Welcome. Hello there, Dr. Zadium. Welcome. And hello there, Private Maverick. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's wonderful to have you all back. How are you all doing this fine evening, afternoon, morning, whatever time zone it is, wherever you are? Oh, excuse me. I'm talking a little too fast. Dr. Zadium, doing well. Julian20, fantabulous. Well, good to hear that. Also, Julian20, time for a beautiful story. Is that a pun? Because, me and puns. Private Maverick, doing all right. Well, doing all right is a positive thing. I mean, it's good that you're doing all right. Glad to hear it. Ah, my dear, wonderful scholars. I've been actually eager to do this stream today. It's been a quiet, listless day. Horace and I really didn't do much today. We kind of just found ourselves in one of the rooms and just kind of lounged and read books as we are tended to do. You know, it's one of those days. Oh, but yes. FT Waits Matsu stream. Yes, yes, yes. This is a Matsu stream. Usually I don't stream on Sundays, but I could not leave a story unfinished. And also, we are running out of time for this season. Oh my goodness. Oh, so, yes. So, yes, tonight's stream, we are going to be reading the second half of The Great God Pan. There are 8 chapters. We got through 4 of them last time. I think I got interrupted a few times. That's why it took so long. And, just in case we get ahead of ourselves, I also have some regular folk horror stories that we can read afterwards. Think of it as a bonus for all of you for coming. Because I care. What was that, horse? Well, of course I care. Okay, now you're just making jokes for the sake of it. I I get it. I get it. Sorry about that. Horace is trying to be funny. Oh my goodness. FT Waste Matsu Quinox because you're worth it. Oh my goodness. Oh, that would make a nice ad. Matsu Quinox because you're worth it. Or would that be in my radio voice? Matsu Quinox because you, my dear wonderful scholars, are worth it. Yeah, I gotta get my hand sensor up at some point so I can actually show my hands. It's getting a little bit tiring not being able to move them. Anyway, I digress. Yes. So, the great god Pan, Arthur Manchin. Last time we left it, for a quick summary, well, maybe not so quick, for those who have missed the last bunch of the reading, the story has so far been about. Wait, how do I start? Where do I start with this? Oh, first off, there was an experiment performed on this young woman who the experimenter claimed that it was in agreement, but it was kind of very obvious that there was a whole Stockholm syndrome thing going on with her. It's kind of creepy, actually. And she apparently witnessed the great god Pan, whatever that means. Then there was a fast forward, and now we are following as a group of young men, well, not young, group of men, let's put it that way, are investigating the mysterious Helen Vaughn, a woman who has basically destroyed the relationships and lives of everyone she has met. And this story has been pretty explicit with, well, it's weird because the story, as I said last time, it's been explicit without being explicit. I mean, you know what they're intending, but they're being subtle enough that they're not saying it directly, if that makes sense. They're having it so you, the dear reader, has to basically fill the little gaps, and then once you do, it kind of makes it really creepy and off-putting. Hello there, cool skeleton. Welcome. Glad to have you here. FT Waste, they're keeping it classy, which is an ironic thing, given at the time that the critics basically salvaged it as being degenerate and a hazard to good society. So they must have had a wonderful imagination. Cool skeleton. Yippee! Matsu story time. Yes, yes, it is story time tonight. Which reminds me, maybe I should actually get started. So, my dear scholars, shall we continue our investigation into the truth behind the great god Pan? I can't do an evil laugh. Yulian 20, yes please. Dr. Zadian, yes! Alright then. Sit back, relax, have a hot or cold beverage of your choice. Dim the lights if you feel brave enough, and let us continue with The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. 5. The Letter of Advice. Do you know Austin? Said Villers as the two friends were pacing sedately along Piccadilly one pleasant morning in May. Do you know, I am convinced that what you told me about Paul Street and the Herberts is a mere episode in an extraordinary history. I may as well confess to you that when I asked you about Herbert a few months ago, I had just seen him. You had seen him? Where? He begged of me in the street one night. He was in the most pitiable plight, but I recognized the man. I got him to tell me his history, or at least the outline of it. In brief, it amounted to this. He had been ruined by his wife. In what manner? He would not tell me. He would only say that she had destroyed him, body and soul. The man is dead now. And what has become of his wife? Ah, that's what I should like to know, and I mean to find her sooner or later. I know a man named Clark, a dry fellow, in fact a man of business, but shrewd enough. You understand my meaning, not shrewd in the mere business sense of the word, but a man who really knows something about men and life. Well, I laid the case before him, and he was evidently impressed. He said it needed consideration, and asked me to come again in the course of a week. A few days later I received this extraordinary letter. Austin took the envelope, drew out the letter, and read it curiously. It ran as follows. My dear Villers, I have thought over the matter on which you consulted me the other night, and my advice to you is this. Throw the portrait into the fire, blot out the story from your mind. Never give it another thought, Villers, or you will be sorry. You will think, no doubt, that I am in possession of some secret information, and to a certain extent that is the case. But I only know a little. I am like a traveler who has peered over an abyss, and is drawn back in terror. What I know is strange enough, and horrible enough, but beyond my knowledge there are depths and horrors more frightful still, more incredible than any tale told of winter nights about the fire. I have resolved, and nothing shall shake that resolve, to explore no whit further, and if you value your happiness, you will make the same determination. Come and see me by all means, but we will talk on more cheerful topics than this. Austin folded the letter methodically, and returned it to Villers. It is certainly an extraordinary letter, he said. What does he mean by the portrait? Ah! I forgot to tell you. I have been to Paul Street and made a discovery. Villers told his story as he had told it to Clark, and Austin listened in silence. He seemed puzzled. How very curious that you should experience such an unpleasant sensation in that room, he said at length. I hardly gather that it was a mere matter of the imagination, a feeling of repulsion, in short. No, it was more physical than mental. It was as if I were inhaling at every breath some deadly fume, which seemed to penetrate to every nerve and bone and sinew of my body. I felt racked from head to foot. My eyes began to grow dim. It was like the entrance of death. Yes, 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 very strange, certainly. You see, your friend confesses that there is some very black story connected with this woman. Did you notice any particular emotion in him when you were telling your tale? Yes, I did. He became very faint, but he assured me that it was a mere passing attack to which he was subject. Did you believe him? I did at the time, but I don't now. He heard what I had to say with a good deal of indifference till I showed him the portrait. It was then that he was seized with the attack of which he spoke. I looked. Yeah. Oh, excuse me. Oh, my goodness. Oh, hello there, Densuo. Welcome. Lurk all you want. He looked ghastly, I assure you. Then he must have seen the woman before. But there might be another explanation. It might have been the name and not the face, which was familiar to him. What do you think? I couldn't say. To the best of my belief, it was after turning the portrait in his hands that he nearly dropped from the chair. The name, you know, was written on the back. Quite so. After all, it is impossible to come to any resolution in a case like this. I hate melodrama, and nothing strikes me as more commonplace and tedious than the ordinary ghost story of commerce. Ordinary ghost story of commerce? What the heck? What does that mean? But really, Villas, it looks as if there was something very queer at the bottom of all this. The two men had, without noticing it, turned up Ashley Street, leading northward from Piccadilly. It was a lawn street, and rather a gloomy one, but here and there a brighter taste had illuminated the dark houses with flowers, and gay curtains, and a cheerful paint on the doors. Villars glanced up as Austin stopped speaking, and looked at one of these houses. Geraniums, red and white, drooped from every sill, and daffodil-colored curtains were draped back from each window. "It looks cheerful, doesn't it?" he said. "Yes, and the inside is still more cheery. One of the pleasantest, huh, one of the pleasantest pronunciation is not my forte tonight, it seems. One of the most pleasant, ah, one of the most pleasant houses of the season. I said it. Okay. So I have heard. I haven't been there myself, but I've met several men who have, and they tell me it's uncommonly jovial. FT Waste, yeah, that's a weird word. It is! It's a weird and hard word to pronounce. Whose house is it? Mrs. Beaumont's. And who is she? I couldn't tell you. I've heard she comes from South America, but after all, who she is of little consequence. She is a very wealthy woman, there's no doubt of that, and some of the best people have taken her up. I hear she has some wonderful claret, really marvelous wine, which must have cost a fabulous sum. Interesting. I can only guess who this woman is. Lord Argentine was telling me about it. He was there last Sunday evening. He assures me he has never tasted such a wine, and Argentine, as you know, is an expert. By the way, that reminds me, she must be an oddish sort of woman, this Mrs. Beaumont. Argentine asked her how old the wine was, and what do you think she said? About 1,000 years, I believe. Lord Argentine thought she was chaffing him, you know, but when he laughed she said she was speaking quite seriously, and offered to show him the jar. Of course, he couldn't say anything more after that, but it seems rather antiquated for a beverage, doesn't it? Why, here we are. Here we are at my rooms. Come in, won't you? Thanks. I think I will. I haven't seen the curiosity shop for a while. It was a room furnished richly, yet oddly, where every jar and bookcase and table, and every rug and jar and ornament seemed to be a thing apart, preserving each its own individuality. Sounds a lot like a few rooms here in the study. "Anything fresh lately?" said Villars after a while. "No, I think not. You saw those queer jugs, didn't you? I thought so. I don't think I've come across anything for the last few weeks." Austin glanced around the room, from cupboard to cupboard, from shelf to shelf, in search of some new oddity. His eyes fell at last on an odd chest, pleasingly and quaintly carved, which stood in a dark corner of the room. "Ah!" he said, "I was forgetting. I have got something to show you." Austin unlocked the chest, drew out a thick quarto volume, laid it on the table, and resumed the cigar he had put down. "Did you know Arthur Mayrick, the painter, Villas?" "A little. I met him 2 or 3 times at the house of a friend of mine. What has become of him? I haven't heard his name mentioned for some time." "He's dead." "You don't say so. Quite young, wasn't he?" "Yes. Only 30 when he died." "What did he die of?" "I don't know. He was an intimate friend of mine, and a thoroughly good fellow. He used to come here and talk to me for hours, and he was one of the best talkers I have met. He could even talk about painting, and that's more than can be said of most painters." Mm. "About 18 months ago he was feeling rather overworked, and partially at my suggestion he went off on a sort of roving expedition, with no definitive end or aim about it. I believe New York was to be his first port, but I never heard from him. 3 months ago I got this book with a very civil letter from an English doctor practicing at Buenos Aires, stating that he had attended the late Mr. Mayrick during his illness, and that the deceased had expressed an earnest wish that the enclosed packet should be sent to me after his death. That was all." "And haven't you written for further mm, and haven't you written for further particulars?" "I have been thinking of doing so. You would advise me to write to the doctor?" "Certainly. And what about the book?" "It was sealed up when I got it. I don't think the doctor has seen it." "Is it something very rare? Mayrick was a collector, perhaps." "No, I think not. Hardly a collector. Now, what do you think of these Ainu jugs?" "Oh, they're Ainu." "Hmm. They are peculiar, but I like them. But aren't you going to show me poor Mayrick's legacy?" "Yes, yes, to be sure. The fact is, it's rather a peculiar sort of thing. I haven't shown it to anyone. I wouldn't say anything about it if I were you. There it is." Villars took the book and opened it at haphazard. "It isn't a printed volume, then?" he said. "No, it is a collection of drawings in black and white by my poor friend Mayrick." Villars turned to the first page. It was blank. The second bore a brief inscription, which he read. Oh, here we go with more Latin, my dear scholars. Let's see if I can read this without butchering it. Oh. "Siliet per diem universis, nexine horori secrius est, lucit nocturnus ignibus chorus," oh boy, this word, Egypanum undequi personatur aduuntur et cantus tibarium et teninius symbalorum per orum maritimam. I have no idea what that means. I wish I did, my dear scholars. I wish I did. It's probably very important to the plot. On the third page was a design which made Villars start and look up at Austin. He was gazing abstractly out of the window. Villars turned page after page, absorbed in spite of himself, in the frightful Walpurgis night of evil, strange monstrous evil, that the dead artist had set forth in hard black and white. The figures of fauns and satyrs and Ajipans danced before his eyes. The darkness of the thicket, the dance on the mountain top, the scenes by lonely shores, in green vineyards, by rocks and desert places, passed before him, a world before which the human soul seemed to shrink back and shudder. Villars whirled over the remaining pages. He had seen enough, but the picture on the last leaf caught his eye as he almost closed the book. Austin! Well, what is it? Do you know who that is? It was a woman's face, alone on the white page. Know who it is? No, of course not. I do. Who is it? It is Mrs. Herbert. Are you sure? I am perfectly sure of it. Poor Merrick. He is one more chapter in her history. What do you think of the designs? They are frightful. Lock the book up again, Austin. If I were you, I would burn it. Must be a terrible companion, even though it be in a chest. Yes, they are singular drawings. But I wonder what connection there could be between Merrick and Mrs. Herbert, and what link between her and these designs. Ah, who could say? It is possible that the matter may end here, and we shall never know. But in my own opinion, this Helen Vaughan, or Mrs. Herbert, is only the beginning. She'll come back to London, Austin. Depend on it. She'll come back, and we shall hear more about her then. I doubt it will be very pleasant news. Oh, the next chapter title is a happy one. Lovely. Have to hydrate. So I'm starting to see a pattern with this Vaughn. I'm sure you, dear scholars, do as well. Again, you can kind of see as we're reading it that there is that proto-Lovecraftian Eldritch horror kind of seeping into this, where the horror is coming from something that is from the outside coming in. Something indescribable. Something, well, not without form, but something that should not be, but is. It's that sort of thing. It's that sort of thing. It's kind of like the next step after folk horror, I want to say, because there is a tiny tinge of folk horror in what we're reading, but it's twisted into something a little bit more, which is rather interesting. 6. The Suicides. Like I said, lovely title. Lord Argentine was a great favorite in London society. At 20 he had been a poor man, decked with the surname of an illustrious family, but forced to earn a livelihood as best he could, and the most speculative of moneylenders would not have entrusted him with £50 on the chance of his ever changing his name for a title, and his poverty for a great fortune. His father had been near enough to the fountain of good things to secure one of the family livings, but the son, even if he had taken orders, would scarcely have obtained so much as this, and moreover felt no vocation for the sorry, I'm trying to get this word right. Hold on 1 second. Ecclesiastical estate, I think it is. Thus he fronted the world with no better armor than the bachelor's gown and the wits of a younger son's grandson, with which equipment he contrived in some way to make a very tolerable fight of it. At 25, Mr. Charles Aubernon saw himself still a man of struggles and of warfare with the world. But out of the 7 who stood before him in the high places of his family, 3 only remained. These 3, however, were good lives, but yet not proof against the Zulu assegais, and typhoid fever, and so one morning Abanon woke up and found himself Lord Argentine, a man of 30 who had faced the difficulties of existence and had conquered. The situation amused him immensely, and he resolved that riches should be as pleasant to him as poverty had always been. Argentine, after some little consideration, came to the conclusion that dining, regarded as a fine art, was perhaps the most amusing pursuit open to fallen humanity, and thus his dinners became famous in London, and an invitation to his table a thing covetously desired. After 10 years of lordship and dinners, Argentine still declined to be jaded, still persisted in enjoying life, and by a kind of infection had become recognized as the cause of joy in others, in short, as the best of company. His sudden and tragic death, therefore, caused a wide and deep sensation. People could scarcely believe it, even though the newspapers was before their eyes, and the cry of "Mysterious death of a nobleman" came ringing up from the street. But there stood the brief paragraph. Lord Argentine was found dead this morning by his valet under distressing circumstances. It is stated that there can be no doubt that his lordship committed suicide, though no motive can be assigned for the act. The deceased nobleman was widely known in society, and much liked for his genial manner and sumptuous hospitality. He is succeeded by etc., etc. By slow degrees the details came to light, but the case still remained a mystery. The chief witness at the inquest was the deceased's valet, who said that the night before his death Lord Argentine had dined with a lady of good position, whose name was suppressed in the newspaper reports. At about 11 o'clock, Lord Argentine had returned, and informed his man that he should not require his services till the next morning. A little later the valet had occasion to cross the hall, and was somewhat astonished to see his master quietly letting himself out at the front door. He had taken off his evening clothes, and was dressed in a Norfolk coat and knickerbockers, and wore a low brown hat. The valet had no reason to suppose that Lord Argentine had seen him, and though his master rarely kept late hours, thought little of the occurrence, till the next morning when he knocked at the bedroom door at 9:15 as usual. He received no answer, and after knocking 2 or 3 times entered the room, and saw Lord Argentine's body leaning forward at an angle from the bottom of the bed. He found that his master had tied a cord securely to one of the short bedposts, and after making a running noose and slipping it round his neck, the unfortunate man must have resolutely fallen forward to die by slow strangulation. Uh, that's not, yeah, that's not the nicest way to go. Let's be honest. He was dressed in the light suit in which the valet had seen him go out, and the doctor who was summoned pronounced that life had been extinct for more than 4 hours. All papers, letters, and so forth seemed in perfect order, and nothing was discovered which pointed in the most remote way to any scandal either great or small. Here the evidence ended. Nothing more could be discovered. Several persons had been present at the dinner party, at which Lord Argentine had assisted, and to all these he seemed in his usual genial spirits. The valet, indeed, said he thought his master appeared a little excited when he came home, but confessed that the alteration in his manner was very slight, hardly noticeable. Indeed, it seemed hopeless to seek for any clue, and the suggestion that Lord Argentine had been suddenly attacked by acute suicidal mania was generally accepted. Need another little sip of water? Excuse me. It was otherwise, however, within 3 weeks. Oh, thank you for the posture check, FT Waste. It's always good to move a little bit. Sitting down when reading can be so difficult on one's back, even when you are an omniversal being whose physical state is only an illusion brought on by the realities of other senses. It was otherwise, however, when within 3 weeks, three more gentlemen, one of them a nobleman, and the two others men of good position and ample means, perished miserably in the almost precisely. Alien 20 redeemed the radio voice. Okay, okay. Been a while since I've done this. Let's hope I can still do it. Okay. It's been a while since I've done radio voice. Hello, all you wonderful scholars. This is Matsu Quinox, coming live from the study. Please enjoy the great god Pan. I hope you're enjoying a bit of thrill down your spine, a bit of chill in your. And I hope all you out there listening enjoy your time here at the study, courtesy of me, Matsu Quinox, Horace, and all of us here. Remember, my dear scholars, I'm doing this all for you. Till then, we're back here at the study. Enjoy. Oh, I think I'm a little bit rough. I think I need to work and practice on that more. Might take some time. Dr. Zame, it might be fun to make radio voice require you to read the next few paragraphs in the voice. Oh my goodness, that would be difficult. That would be interesting. Oh my goodness. Maybe next time. Maybe next time. Where was I? I'll start at the beginning of this paragraph again. It was otherwise, however, when within 3 weeks, three more gentlemen, one of them a nobleman, and the two others men of good position and ample means, perished miserably in the almost precisely the same manner. In the almost precisely the same manner? That sounds a little bit weird when read out loud. In the almost precisely the same manner. I suppose his editor missed out on that one. Huh. In the almost precisely the same manner, Lord Swanley was found one morning in his dressing room, hanging from a peg affixed to the wall, and Mr. Collier Stewart and Mr. Harris had chosen to die as Lord Argentine. There was no explanation in either case. A few bald facts. A living man in the evening, and a body with a black swollen face in the morning. The police had been forced to confess themselves powerless to arrest or to explain the sordid murders of Whitechapel, but before the horrible suicides of Piccadilly and Mayfair, they were dumbfounded, for not even the mere ferocity which did duty as an explanation of the crimes of the East End could be of service in the West. Each of these men who had resolved to die a tortured, shameful death was rich, prosperous, and to all appearances in love with the world, and not the acutest research should ferret out any shadow of a lurking motive in either case. One moment, my dear scholars, I will be right back. Sorry about that, my dear scholars. Ovid crashed into one of the bookshelves. Um, Poor fellow, he was being chased. Managed to get him out though. Where was I? Oh yeah. And not the acutest research should ferret out any shadow of a lurking motive in either case. There was a horror in the air, and men looked at one another's faces when they met, each wondering whether the other was to be the victim of the fifth nameless tragedy. Journalists sought in vain in their scrapbooks for materials whereof to concoct reminiscent articles, and the morning paper was unfolded in many a house with a feeling of awe. No man knew when or where the next blow would light. F2H glad everything's okay. Yeah, yeah, it's Ovid. He is a what's sort of he's a crimson book squid, so he's slightly bigger than most book squids. I mean, he's friendly, he's nice, he's honestly a little timid. I wish he'd get a little more courage in him. And he helps around, but he has this tendency to be a little clumsy when he moves fast, and more than once he's accidentally bumped into things and knocked things over, and usually we have to dig him out of piles of books, and then comes the apologies and the guilty feelings, and then he spends the rest of the time over overdoing it in making up for what he did. And I mean, he's a very nice fellow, but just wish he would not do that. A short while after the last of these terrible events, Austin came to see Mr. Villars. He was curious to know whether Villars had succeeded in discovering any fresh traces of Mrs. Herbert, either through Clark or by other sources, and he asked the question soon after he had sat down. "No," said Villars. "I wrote to Clark, but he remains obdurate. Obdurant? Obdurant. And I have tried other channels, but without any result. I can't find out what became of Helen Vaughan after she left Paul Street, but I think she must have gone abroad. But to tell the truth, Austin, I haven't paid much attention to the matter for the last few weeks. I knew poor Harry's intimately, and his terrible death has been a great shock to me, a great shock." "I can believe, I can well believe it," answered Austin gravely. "You know, Argentine was a friend of mine. If I remember rightly, we were speaking of him that day you came to his room. Yes, it was in connection with that house in Ashley Street, Mrs. Beaumont's house. You said something about Argentines dining there." "Quite so. Of course you know it was there Argentine died the night before his death." "No, I've not heard that." "Oh yes, the name was kept out of the papers to spare Mrs. Beaumont. Argentine was a great favourite of hers, and it is said she was in a terrible state for some time after." A curious look came over Villar's face. He seemed undecided whether to speak or not. Austin began again. "I never experienced such a feeling of horror as when I read the account of Argentine's death. I didn't understand it at the time, and I don't now. I knew him well, and it completely passes my understanding for what possible cause he, or any of the others for the matter of that, could have resolved in cold blood to die in such an awful manner. You know how men babble away each other's characters in London. You may be sure any buried scandal or hidden skeleton would have been brought to light in such a case as this. But nothing of the sort has taken place. As for the theory of mania, that is very well, of course, for coroner's jury, but everybody knows that it's all nonsense. Suicidal mania is not smallpox." Austin relapsed into gloomy silence. Villars sat silent also, watching his friend. The expression of indecision still fleeted across his face. "Cool Skeleton, who said I was hiding?" Do you routinely, I suppose you aren't the sort to routinely hide, though, Cool Skeleton. You're not that kind. The expression of indecision still fleeted all across his face. He seemed as if weighing his thoughts in the balance, and the considerations he was resolving left him still silent. Austin tried to shake off the remembrance of tragedies as hopeless and perplexed as the labyrinth of Dalius, and began to talk in an indifferent voice of the more pleasant incidences and adventures of the season. Cole Skeleton, I mean, maybe for a little spook. Well, yes, I suppose so. Private Maverick, well, folks kept skeletons in their closets. I don't think we have any here. Maybe we do. Maybe it's a room I haven't explored yet. That Mrs. Beaumont, he said, of whom we were speaking, is a great success. She has taken London almost by storm. I met her the other night at Fulham's. She is really a remarkable woman. You have met Mrs. Beaumont? Yes, she had quite a court around her. She would be called very handsome, I suppose, and yet there is something about her face which I didn't like. The features are exquisite, but the expression is strange. And all the time I was looking at her, and afterwards, when I was going home, I had a curious feeling that very expression was in some way or another familiar to me. You must have seen her in the Row. No, I'm sure I never set eyes on the woman before. It is that which makes it puzzling, and to the best of my belief I have never seen anyone like her. What I felt was a kind of dim, far-off memory, vague but persistent. The only sensation I can compare it to is that odd feeling one sometimes has in a dream, when fantastic cities and wondrous lands and phantom personages appear familiar and accustomed. Excuse me. Villers nodded and glanced aimlessly around the room, possibly in search of something on which to turn the conversation. His eyes fell on an old chest somewhat like that in which the artist's strange legacy lay hid beneath a Gothic scutcheon. No idea what a scutcheon is, but okay. Have you written to the doctor about poor Merrick? He asked. Yes, I wrote, asking for full particulars as to his illness and death. I don't expect to have an answer for another 3 weeks or a month. I thought I might as well inquire whether Merrick knew an Englishwoman named Herbert, and if so, whether the doctor could give me any information about her. But it's very possible that Merrick fell in with her at New York, or Mexico, or San Francisco. I have no idea as to the extent or direction of his travels. Yes, and it is very possible that the woman may have more than one name. Exactly. I wish I had thought of asking you to lend me the portrait of her which you possess. I might have enclosed it in my letter to Dr. Matthews. So you might. That never occurred to me. We might send it now. Hark! What are those boys calling? While the two men had been talking together, a confused noise of shouting had been gradually growing louder. The noise rose from the eastward and swelled down Piccadilly, drawing nearer and nearer, a very torrent of sound, surging up streets usually quiet and making every window a frame for a face, curious or excited. The cries and voices came echoing up the silent street where Villers lived, growing more distinct as they advanced, and as Villers spoke, an answer rang up from the pavement. The gonna try and do my paperboy voice. The West End horrors! Another awful suicide! Full details! Austin rushed down the stairs and bought a paper and read out the paragraph to Villers as the uproar in the street rose and fell. The window was open, and the air seemed full of noise and terror. Another gentleman has fallen a victim to the terrible epidemic of suicide which for the last month has prevailed in the West End. Mr. Sidney Crushaw of Stoke House, Fulham, and King's Pomeroy, Devon, was found, after prolonged search, hanging dead from the branch of a tree in his garden at 1 o'clock today. Oh my goodness, that is gruesome. Music. The deceased gentleman dined last night at the Carlton Club and seemed in his usual health and spirits. He left the club at about 10 o'clock and was seen walking leisurely up St. James Street a little later. Subsequent to this, his movements cannot be traced. On the discovery of the body, medical aid was at once summoned, but life had evidently been long extinct. So far as is known, Mr. Crenshaw had no trouble and anxiety of any kind. This painful suicide, it will be remembered, is the fifth of the kind in the last month. The authorities at Scotland Yard are unable to suggest any explanation of these terrible occurrences. Austin put down the paper in mute horror. I shall leave London tomorrow, he said. It is a city of nightmares. How awful this is, Villars. Mr. Villars was sitting by the window, quietly looking out into the street. He had listened to the newspaper report attentively, and the hint of indecision was no longer on his face. Wait a moment, Austin, he replied. I have made up my mind to mention a little matter that occurred last night. It's stated, I think, that Crenshaw was last seen alive at St. James Street shortly after 10. Yes, I think so. I will look again. Yes, you are quite right. Quite so. Well, I am in a position to contradict that statement at all events. Crenshaw was seen after that, considerably later indeed. How do you know? Because I happened to see Crenshaw myself at about 2 o'clock this morning. You saw Crenshaw? You, Villars? Yes, I saw him quite distinctly indeed. There were but a few feet between us. Where in heaven's name did you see him? Not far from here. I saw him in Ashley Street. He was just leaving a house. Did you notice what house it was? Yes, it was Mrs. Beaumont's. Dun dun dun. Villars, think what you are saying. There must be some mistake. How could Crenshaw be in Mrs. Beaumont's house at 2 o'clock in the morning? Surely you must have been dreaming. Villars, you were always rather fanciful. Why is that such an amazing thing to this man? I mean, why is that such a fanciful idea? I don't get that. See, it just seems a little bit odd that he would protest that. No, I was wide awake enough. Even if I had been dreaming, as you say, what I saw would have roused me effectively. What you saw? What did you see? Was there anything strange about Crenshaw? But I can't believe it. It is impossible. Well, if you like, I will tell you what I saw. Or, if you please, what I think I saw, and you can judge for yourself. Very good, Villars. The noise and clamor of the street had died away, though now and then the sound of shouting still came from the distance, and the dull leaden silence seemed like the quiet after an earthquake or a storm. Villars turned from the window and began speaking. I was at a house near Regent's Park last night, and when I came away the fancy took me to walk home instead of taking a hansom. It was a clear, pleasant night enough, and after a few minutes I had the streets pretty much to myself. It's a curious thing, Austin, to be alone in London at night. The gas lamps stretching away in perspective, and the dead silence, and then perhaps the rushing clatter of a hansom on the stones, and the fire starting up under the horses' hoofs. I walked along pretty briskly, for I was feeling a little tired of being out in the night, and as the clocks were striking 2, I turned down Ashley Street, which you know is on my way. It was quieter than ever there, and the lamps were fewer. Together it looked as dark and gloomy as a forest in winter. I had done about half the length of the street when I heard a door close very softly, and naturally I looked up to see who was abroad like myself at such an hour. As it happens, there is a street lamp close to the house in question, and I saw a man standing on the step. He had just shut the door, and his face was toward me, and I recognized Crenshaw directly. I never knew him to speak to, but I had often seen him, and I am positive that I was not mistaken in my man. I looked into his face for a moment, and then, I will confess the truth, I set off at a good run and kept it up till I was within my own door. Why? Why? Because it made my blood run cold to see that man's face. I could never have supposed that such an infernal medley of passions could have glared out of any human eyes. I almost fainted as I looked. I knew I had looked into the eyes of a lost soul, Austin. The man's outward form remained, but all hell was within it. Furious lust and hate that was like fire, and the loss of all hope and horror that seemed to shriek aloud to the night, though his teeth were shut, and the utter blackness of despair. I am sure that he did not see me. Hold on, I'm hearing another noise. My dear scholars, one moment. Sorry about that. Virgil is teasing Ovid. Had to break them up. Okay. Who knew who knew the more friendly book squids could be just as active as the hostile ones? I'm telling you. Where was I? Furious lust and hate that was like fire, and the loss of all hope and horror that seemed to shriek aloud to the night. Though his teeth were shut in the utter blackness of despair, I am sure he did not see me, and he saw nothing that you or I can see. But what he saw I hope we never shall. I do not know when he died. I suppose in an hour or perhaps two. But when I passed down Ashley Street and heard the closing door, that man no longer belonged to this world. It was a devil's face I looked upon. There was an interval of silence in the room when Villars ceased speaking. The light was failing, and all the tumult of an hour ago was quite hushed. Austin had bent his head at the close of the story, and his hand covered his eyes. "What can it mean?" he said at length. "Who knows, Austin? Who knows? It's a black business, but I think we had better keep it to ourselves. For the present, at any rate. I will see if I cannot learn anything about that house through private channels of information. And if I do light upon anything, I will let you know." Oh boy, we are coming close, my dear scholars, to the climax of this tale. Oh, there's a lot of dread in this story. Although it feels like most of the story is them sitting around and talking. Which is almost more frightening if you think about it, because they're not directly seeing what's happening, they're only hearing it. So the experience of the horror is secondhand for all these characters. So for them, it's almost worse because they have no idea what the actual horror is. They can only guess at it. Except for maybe Clark, who might have a better idea. 7. The Encounter in Soho. Three weeks later, Austin received a note from Villars, asking him to call either that afternoon or the next. He chose the nearer date, and found Villars sitting as usual by the window, apparently lost in meditation on the drowsy traffic of the street. There was a bamboo table by his side, a fantastic thing, enriched with gilding and queer painted scenes, and on it lay a little pile of papers arranged and docketed as neatly as anything in Mr. Clark's office. "Well, Villars, have you made any discoveries in the last 3 weeks?" "I think so. I have here one or two memoranda which struck me as singular, and there's a statement to which I shall call your attention." "And these documents relate to Mrs. Beaumont? It was really Crawshaw whom you saw that night standing on the doorstep of the house in Ashley Street?" "As to that matter, my belief remains unchanged, but neither my inquiry nor their results have any special relation to Crawshaw. But my investigations have had a strange issue. I have found out who Mrs. Beaumont is." "Who is she? In what way do you mean?" "I mean that you and I know her better under another name." What name is that? Herbert. Herbert. Austin repeated the word, dazed with astonishment. I knew it, I knew it. Yes, Mrs. Herbert of Paul Street. Helen Vaughan of early adventures, unknown to me. You had reason to recognize the expression of her face when you go home look at... Yeah, you had reason to recognize the expression of her face. When you go home, look at the face in Mayrick's Book of Horrors, and you will know the sources of your recollection. And you have proof of this? Yes, the best of proof. I have seen Mrs. Beaumont. Or shall we say, Mrs. Herbert. Where did you see her? Hardly in a place where you would expect to see a lady who lives in Ashley Street, Piccadilly. I saw her entering a house in one of the meanest and most disreputable streets in Soho. In fact, I had made an appointment, though not with her, and she was precise to both time and place. All this seems very wonderful, but I cannot call it incredible. You must remember, Villiers, that I have seen this woman in the ordinary adventure of London society, talking and laughing, and sipping her coffee in a commonplace drawing room with commonplace people. But you know what you are saying. I do. I have not allowed myself to be led by surmises or fancies. It was with no thought of finding Helen Vaughan that I searched for Mrs. Beaumont in the dark waters of the life of London. But such has been the issue. You must have been in strange places, Villiers. Yes, I have been in very strange places. It would have been useless, you know, to go to Ashley Street and ask Mrs. Beaumont to give me a short sketch of her previous history. No, assuming as I had to assume that her record was not the cleanest, it would be pretty certain that at some previous time she must have moved in circles not quite so refined as her present ones. If you see mud at the top of a stream, you may be sure that it was once at the bottom. I went to the bottom. I have always been fond of diving into Queer Street for my amusement. I found my knowledge of that locality and its inhabitants very useful. It is perhaps needless to say that my friends had never heard the name Beaumont, and I had never I'm getting ahead of myself again. And as I had never seen the lady and was quite unable to describe her, I had to set to work in an indirect way. The people there know me. I have been able to do some of them a service now and again, so they made no difficulty about giving their information. They were aware I had no communication, direct or indirect, with Scotland Yard. I had to cast out a good many lines, though, before I got what I wanted. And when I landed the fish, I did not for a moment suppose it was my fish. But I listened to what I was told out of constitutional liking for useless information, and I found myself in possession of a very curious story, though, as I imagine, not the story I was looking for. Excuse me. It was to this effect. Some 5 or 6 years ago, a woman named Raymond suddenly made her appearance in the neighborhood to which I am referring. She was described to me as being quite young, probably not more than 17 or 18, very handsome, and looking as if she came from the country. I should be wrong in saying that she found her level in going to this particular quarter, or associating with these people, for from what I was told, I should think the worst den in London far too good for her. The person from whom I got my information, as you may suppose, no great Puritan, shuddered and grew sick in telling me of the nameless infamies which were laid to her charge. After living there for a year, or perhaps a little more, she disappeared as suddenly as she came, and they saw nothing of her till about the time of the Paul Street case. At first she came to her old haunts only occasionally, then more frequently, and finally took up her abode there as before, and remained for 6 or 8 months. It's of no use my going into details as to the life that woman led. If you want particulars, you can look at Mayrick's legacy. Those designs were not drawn from his imagination. So, I'm pausing this here for a second to point out this. The fact that this line is like just briefly there, but if you read it in between the lines, this line is so important because he just said, if you want particulars, you can look at Mayrick's legacy. Those designs were not drawn from his imagination. And as was mentioned before, as was read before, the designs are of like satyrs, fauns, all these really frightening mythological creatures. And to go back to like a Lovecraftian, proto Lovecraftian connection, those who have read Lovecraft, I'm not going to try and spoil it, there is a story called Pickman's Model, where the very line in it is the line, these were not drawn from, where FT Wastes, my favorite. Oh, good, good. So you know what I'm talking about. Cool skeleton Pickman's Model. No, but there is a line, and I'm sure Wastes is aware of this. There is a line in there where they talk about the designs in that story not drawn from imagination. So the fact that they slip in this line very quickly for the reader, I think it's kind of clever because it's drawn so quickly in there that unless you're like reading carefully or remember what's earlier, this line is absolutely horrifying to the reader because now we know a little bit more of the secret of Helen Vaughn in a way, and perhaps why all these people are going insane around her. But I find that interesting that that line is in there. So where were we? Ah, yes. She again disappeared, and the people of the place saw nothing of her till a few months ago. My informant told me that she had taken some rooms in a house which he pointed out, and these rooms she was in the habit of visiting 2 or 3 times a week, and always at 10 in the morning. I was led to expect that one of these visits would be paid on a certain day about a week ago, and I accordingly managed to be on the lookout in company with my cicerone at 9:45, and the hour, and the lady came with equal punctuality. My friend and I were standing under an archway a little way back from the street. But she saw us, and gave me a glance that I shall be long in forgetting. That look was quite enough for me. I knew Miss Raymond to be Mrs. Herbert. As for Mrs. Beaumont, she had quite gone out of my head. She went into the house, and I watched it till 4 o'clock, when she came out, and then I followed her. It was a lawn chase, and I had to be very careful to keep a long way in the background, and yet not lose sight of the woman. She took me down to the Strand, and then to Westminster, and then up St. James Street and along Piccadilly. I felt queerish when I saw her turn up Ashley Street. The thought that Mrs. Herbert was Mrs. Beaumont came into my mind, but it seemed too impossible to be true. I waited at the corner, keeping my eye on her all the time, and I took particular care to note the house at which she stopped. It was the house with the gay curtains, the house of flowers, the house out of which Crashaw came the night he hanged himself in his garden. I was just going away with my discovery when I saw an empty carriage come round and draw up in front of the house, and I came to the conclusion that Mrs. Herbert was going out for a drive, and I was right. There, as it happened, I met a man I know, and we stood talking together a little distance from the carriageway, to which I had my back. We had not been there for 10 minutes when my friend took off his hat, and I glanced round and saw the lady I had been following all day. "Who is that?" I said, and his answer was, "Mrs. Beaumont, lives in Ashley Street." Of course, there could be no doubt after that. I don't know whether she saw me, and I don't think she did. I went home at once, and on consideration I thought that I had sufficiently good case with which to go to Clark. "Why to Clark?" "Because I am sure that Clark is in possession of facts about this woman, facts of which I know nothing." "Well, what then?" Mr. Villars leaned back in his chair and looked reflectively at Austin for a moment before he answered. My idea was that Clark and I should call on Mrs. Beaumont. You would never go into such a house as that. No, no, Villars, you cannot do it. Besides, consider what result. I will tell you soon, but I was going to say that my information does not end here. It has been completed in an extraordinary manner. Another drink of water. I have to always keep hydrated, my dear scholars. Always keep hydrated. Look at this neat little packet of manuscript. Excuse me. It is pageanted, you see, and I've indulged in the civil coquetry of a ribbon of red tape. It has almost a legal air, hasn't it? Run your eye over it, Austin. It is an account of the excuse me. It is an I am slipping over my words now. It is an account of the entertainment Mrs. Beaumont provided for her choicer guests. The man who wrote this escaped with his life, but I do not think he will live many years. The doctors tell him he must have sustained some severe shock to the nerves. Austin took the manuscript, but never read it. Opening the neat pages at haphazard, his eye was caught by a word and a phrase that followed it. And sick at heart, with white lips and a cold sweat pouring like water from his temples, he flung the paper down. Take it away, Villars. Never speak of this again. Are you made of stone, man? Why, the dread and horror of death itself, the thoughts of the man who stands in the keen morning air on the black platform, bound, the bell tolling in his ears, and waits for the harsh rattle of the bolt, are as nothing compared to this. I will not read it. I should never sleep again. Very good. I can fancy what you saw. Yes, it is horrible enough, but after all, it is an old story, an old mystery played in our day, and in dim London streets instead of amidst the vineyards and the olive gardens. We know what happened to those who chanced to meet the great god Pan, and those who are wise know that all symbols are symbols of something, not of nothing. It was indeed an exquisite symbol beneath which men long ago veiled their knowledge of the most awful, most secret forces which lie at the heart of all things, forces before which the souls of men must wither and die and blacken, as their bodies blacken under the electric current. Such forces cannot be named, cannot be spoken, cannot be imagined, except under a veil, and a symbol to the most of us appearing to quaint poetic fancy, to some a foolish tale. But you and I, at all events, have known something of the terror that may dwell in the secret place of life, manifest under human flesh, that which is without form taking to itself a form. Oh, Austin, how could it be? How is it that the very sunlight does not turn to blackness before this thing, the hard earth melt, and boil beneath such a burden? Villars was pacing up and down the room, and the beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. Austin sat silent for a while, but Villars saw him make a sign upon his breast. I say again, Villars, you will surely never enter such a house as that. You would never pass out alive. Yes, Austin, I shall go out alive. I and Clark with me. What do you mean? You cannot. You would not dare. Wait a moment. The air was very pleasant and fresh this morning. There was a breeze blowing even through this dull street, and I thought I would take a walk. Piccadilly stretched before me a clear, bright vista, and the sun flashed on the carriages and on the quivering leaves in the park. It was a joyous morning, and men and women looked into the sky and smiled as they went about their work or their pleasure. The wind blew as blithely as upon the meadows and the scented gorse. But somehow or other I got out of the bustle and the gaiety, and found myself walking slowly along a quiet, dull street, where there seemed to be no sunshine and no air, and where the few foot passengers loitered as they walked, and hung indecisively about the corners and archways. I walked along, hardly knowing where I was going or what I did there, but feeling impelled, as one sometimes is, to explore still further, with a vague idea of reaching some unknown goal. Thus I forged up the street, noting the small traffic of the milk shop, and wondering at the incongruous medley of excuse me, incongruous medley of penny pipes, black tobacco, sweets, newspapers, and comic songs, which here and there jostled one another in the short compass of a single window. I think it was a cold shudder that suddenly passed through me that first told me that I had found what I wanted. I looked up from the pavement and stopped before a dusty shop, above which the lettering had faded, where the red bricks of 200 years ago had grimed to black, where the windows had gathered to themselves the dust of winters innumerable. I saw what I required, but I think it was 5 minutes before I had steadied myself and could walk in and ask for it in a cool voice and with a calm face. I think there must have even there must even bleh. I think there must even then have been a tremor in my words, for the old man who came out of the back parlour and fumbled slowly amongst his goods looked oddly at me as he tied the parcel. I paid when he asked, and stood leaning by the counter, with a strange reluctance to take up my goods and go. I asked about the business, and learnt that trade was bad and the profits cut down sadly, but then the street was not what it was before traffic had been diverted. But that was done 40 years ago, just before my father died, he said, and I got away at last, and walked along sharply. It was a dismal street indeed, and I was glad to return the bustle and the noise. Would you like to see my purchase? I hate to know what this is going to be. Austin said nothing, but nodded his head slightly. He still looked white and sick. Villers pulled out a drawer in the bamboo table and showed Austin a long coil of cord, hard and new, and at one end was a running noose. "It is the best hempen cord," said Villers, "just as it used to be made for the old trade. The man told me, not an inch of jut from end to end." Austin set his teeth hard and stared at Villers, growing whiter as he looked. Oh my, oh my goodness. Primaric, time to dance the hempen jig. Oh my goodness. "You would not do it," he murmured at last. "You would not have blood on your hands. My God!" he exclaimed with sudden vehemence. "You cannot mean this, Villers, that you would make yourself a hangman?" "No. I shall offer a choice, and leave Helen Vaughan alone with this cord in a locked room for 15 minutes. If when we go in it is not done, I shall call the nearest policeman. That is all." That is cold. That is so cold-blooded, my dear scholars. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh. Oh, this was written in 1890. That is so cold. I I must go now. I cannot stay here any longer. I cannot bear this. Good night. Good night, Austin. Good night, Austin. The door shut, but in a moment it was open again, and Austin stood, white and ghastly, in the entrance. "I was forgetting," he said, "that I too have something to tell. I received a letter from Dr. Harding of Buenos Aires. He said that he attended Merrick for 3 weeks before his death." "And does he say what carried him off in the prime of life? It was not fever?" "No, it was not fever. According to the doctor, it was an utter collapse of the whole system, probably caused by some severe shock. But he states that the patient would tell him nothing, and that he was consequently at some disadvantage in treating the case. Is there anything more? Yes. Dr. Harding ends his letter by saying, I think this is all the information I can give you about your poor friend. He had not been long in Buenos Aires and knew scarcely anyone with the exception of a person who did not bear the best of characters, and has since left. A Mrs. Vaughn. Oh boy. As I was reading that, I was just holding my breath. Oh my goodness. That I mean, I wasn't expecting much, but oh my goodness, that is intense. Thank you for the posture check, FT Waste. Oh, it's just oh my goodness, that is tense. That is an intense bit there. Using, using. Mm. Oh my goodness. Dust. Holding my breath. FT Waste, bless you. Thank you. Even an omniversal librarian can cough and sneeze. Just remember that, my dear scholars. Always be careful about the amount of dust around you. Want to make sure you're breathing all right. All right, my dear scholars. Are you ready for the last chapter of this tale? Are you ready for this? Cool skeleton, maybe. Julian 20, yes. Primaric, yes. All right. 8. The Fragments. Amongst the papers of the well-known physician Dr. Robert Matheson of Ashley Street, Piccadilly, who died suddenly of epileptic seizure at the beginning of 1892, a leaf of manuscript paper was found, covered with pencil jottings. These notes were in Latin, much abbreviated, and had evidently been made in great haste. The MS was only deciphered with difficulty, and some words have up to the present time evaded all the efforts of the expert employed. The date, XXV July 1888, is written on the right-hand corner of the MS. The following is a translation of Dr. Matheson's manuscript. Whether science would benefit by these brief notes if they could be published, I do not know, but rather doubt. But certainly I shall never take the responsibility of publishing or divulging one word of what is here written, not only on account of my oath given freely to those 2 other persons who were present, but also because the details are too abominable. It is probably that upon mature consideration and after weighing the good and evil, I shall one day destroy this paper, or at least leave it under seal to my friend D, trusting in his discretion to use it or to burn it as he may think fit. As was befitting, I did all that my knowledge suggested to make sure that I was suffering under no delusion. At first astonished, I could hardly think, but in a minute's time I was sure that my pulse was steady and regular, and that I was in my real and true sense. I then fixed my eyes quietly on what was before me. Though horror and revolting nausea rose up within me, and an odor of corruption choked my breath, I remained firm. I was then privileged or cursed, I dare not say which, to see that which was on the bed, lying there black like ink, transformed before my eyes. The skin and the flesh and the muscles and the bones and the firm structure of the human body that I had thought to be unchangeable and permanent as adamant began to melt and dissolve. I know that the body may be separated into its elements by external agencies, but I should have refused to believe what I saw, For here there was some internal force of which I knew nothing that caused dissolution and change. Here too was all the work by which man had been made repeated before my eyes. I saw the form waver from sex to sex, dividing itself from itself and then again reunited. Then I saw the body descend to the beasts whence it ascended, and then which was on the heights go down to the depths, even to the abyss of all being. The principle of life which makes organism always remained, while the outward form changed. The light within the room had turned to blackness, not the darkness of night in which objects are seen dimly, for I could see clearly and without difficulty, but it was the negation of light. Objects were presented to my eyes, if I may say so, without any medium, in such a manner that if there had been a prism in the room I should have seen no colors represented in it. I watched, and at last I saw nothing but a substance as jelly. Then the ladder was ascended again. Here the MS is illegible, and for one instant I saw a form, shaped in dimness before me, which I will not further describe. But the symbol of this form may be seen in ancient sculptures and in paintings, which survive beneath the lava, too foul to be spoken of, as a horrible and unspeakable shape. Neither man nor beast was changed into human form. There came finally death. I who saw all this, not without great horror and loathing of soul, here write my name, declaring all that I have set on this paper to be true. Robert Matheson, Medical Doctor. Such, Raymond, is the story of which I know, and what I have seen. The burden of it was too heavy for me to bear alone, and yet I could tell it to none but you, Villiers, who was with me at the last. Knows but you. Villiers, who was with me at the last, knows nothing of that awful secret of the wood, of what we both saw die, lay upon the smooth sweet turf amidst the summer flowers, half in sun and half in shadow, and holding the girl Rachel's hand, called and summoned those companions, and shaped in solid form upon the earth we tread upon, the horror which we can but hint at, which we can only name under a figure. I would not tell Villiers of this, nor of that resemblance, which struck me as with a blow upon my heart, when I saw the portrait, which filled the cup of terror at the end. What this can mean I dare not guess. I know that what I saw perish was not Mary, and yet in the last agony Mary's eyes looked into mine. Whether there can be any one who can show the last link in this chain of awful mystery I do not know, but if there be any one who can do this, you, Raymond, are the man, and if you know the secret, it rests with you to tell it or not as you please. I am writing this letter to you immediately on my getting back to town. I have been in the country for the last few days. Perhaps you may be able to guess in which part. While the horror and wonder of London was at its height, for Mrs. Beaumont, as I have told you, was well known in society, I wrote to my friend Dr. Phillips, giving some brief outline, or rather hint, of what happened, and asking him to tell me the name of the village where the events he had related to me occurred. He gave me the name, as he said with the less hesitation, because Rachel's father and mother were dead, and the rest of the family had gone to a relative in the state of Washington 6 months before. The parents, he said, had undoubtedly died of grief and horror caused by the terrible death of their daughter, and by what had gone before that death. On the evening of the day which I received Philip's letter, I was at Karaman, and standing beneath the mouldering Roman walls, white with the winters of 1700 years, I looked over the meadow where once had stood the older temple of the god of the deeps, and saw a house gleaming in the sunlight. It was the house where Helen had lived. I stayed at Carmen for several days. The people of the place I found knew little and had guessed less. Those whom I spoke on the matter seemed surprised that an antiquarian, as I professed myself to be, should trouble about a village tragedy of which they gave a very commonplace version. And as you may imagine, I told nothing of what I knew. Most of my time was spent in the great wood that rises just above the village and climbs the hillside and goes down to the river in the valley. Such another long, lovely valley, Raymond, as that on which we looked one summer night, walking to and fro before your house. For many an hour I strayed through the maze of the forest, turning now to right and now to left, pacing slowly down long alleys of undergrowth, shadowy and chill even under the midday sun, and halting beneath great oaks. Lying on the short turf of a clearing where the faint sweet scent of wild roses came to me on the wind, and mixed with the heavy perfume of the elder, whose mingled odor is like the odor of the room of the dead, a vapor of incense and corruption. I stood at the edges of the woods, gazing at all the pomp and procession of the foxgloves towering amidst the bracken and shining red in the broad sunshine, and beyond them into deep thickets of close undergrowth, where springs boil up from the rock and nourish the water weeds, dank and evil. But in all my wanderings I avoided one part of the wood. It was not till yesterday that I climbed to the summit of the hill, and stood upon the ancient Roman road that threads the highest ridge of the wood. Here they had walked, Helen and Rachel, along this quiet causeway, upon the pavement of green turf shut in on either side by high banks of red earth, and tall hedges of shining beech, and here I followed in their steps, looking out now and again through partings in the boughs, and seeing on one side the sweep of the wood stretching far to the right and left, and seeking into the broad level and beyond the yellow sea and the land beyond over the sea. On the other side was the valley and the river, and hill following hill as wave on wave, and wood and meadow and cornfield and white houses gleaming, and a great wall of mountain and far blue peaks in the north. And so at last I came to the place. The track went up a gentle slope and widened out into an open space with a wall of thick undergrowth around it, and then narrowing again passed on as the distance in the faint blue mist of summer heat, and into this pleasant summer glade Rachel passed a girl, and left it. Who shall say what? I did not stay long there. In a small town near Carriman there is a museum, containing for the most part Roman remains which have been found in the neighborhood at various times. On the day after my arrival in Carriman, I walked over to the town in question, and took the opportunity of inspecting the museum. After I had seen most of the sculpted stones, the coffins, rings, coins, and fragments of tessellated pavement which the place contains, I was shown a small square pillar of white stone, which had been recently discovered in the woods of which I have been speaking, as I found on inquiry in that open space where the Roman road broadens out. On one side of the pillar was an inscription of which I took a note. Some of the letters have been defaced, but I do not think there can be any doubt as to those which I supply. Let me get a quick drink. The inscription is as follows: Divomon ondenti flave essentialis posvit propter nive pitias quae I can't pronounce all these words. This. And here's the translation. To the great god Nodens, the god of the great deep or abyss, Flavius Senelius has erected this pillar on account of the marriage which he saw beneath the shade. The custodian of the museum informed me that local antiquarians were much puzzled, not by the inscription, or by any difficulty in translating it, but as to the circumstance or rite to which allusion is made. And now, my dear Clark, as to what you tell me about Helen Vaughan, whom you say you saw die under circumstances of the utmost and almost incredible horror. I was interested in your account, but a good deal. Nay, all of what you told me I knew already. I can understand the strange likeness you remarked in both the portrait and in the actual face. You have seen Helen's mother. You remember that still summer night so many years ago when I talked to you of the world beyond the shadows, and of the god Pan. You remember Mary. She was the mother of Helen Vaughan, who was born 9 months after that night. Oh, that's the connection. All right. Mary never recovered her reason. She lay as you saw her, all the while upon her bed, and a few days after the child was born she died. I fancy that just at the last she knew me. I was standing by the bed, and the old look came into her eyes for a second, and then she shuddered and groaned and died. It was an ill work I did that night when you were present. I broke open the door of the house of life, without knowing or caring what might pass forth or enter in. I recollect your telling me at the time, sharply enough and rightly too, in one sense, that I had ruined the reason of a human being by a foolish experiment, based on an absurd theory. You did well to blame me, but my theory was not at all absurdity. What I said Mary would see, she saw, but I forgot that no human eye can look on such a sight with impunity. And I forgot, as I have just said, that when the house of life is thus thrown open, there may enter in that for which we have no name, and human flesh may become the veil of a horror one dare not express. I played with energies which I did not understand. You have seen the ending of it. Helen Vaughan did well to bind the cord about her neck and die, though the death was horrible. The blackened face, the hideous form upon the bed, changing and melting before your eyes, from woman to man, from man to beast, and from beast to worse than beast. All the strange horror that you witnessed surprises me but little. What you say the doctor whom you sent for saw and shuddered as I noticed long ago I noticed long ago. I knew what I had done the moment the child was born, and when it was scarcely 5 years old, I surprised it, not once or twice, but several times with a playmate. You may guess of what kind. It was for me a constant, an incarnate horror, and after a few years I felt I could bear it no more, and I sent Helen Vaughan away. You know now what frightened the boy in the wood. The rest of the strange story and all else that you tell me, as discovered by your friend, I have contrived to learn from time to time, almost, almost to the last chapter, and now Helen is with her companions. The end. Wow, that story. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, my dear scholars. That was a weirdly intense story. It's not a very long story, but it is intense in those few spaces. I can see why it captured the imagination of H.P. Lovecraft and other authors. It really is nothing like anything that had been written before. The idea that they accidentally opened the gateway, some invisible gateway, to something not of that reality, and bring it into their reality in a fleshed form is I could see why it would be frightening to them, and I could see why the critics were horrified by it. I mean, it is a very intense, very twisted story in a way. Oh my goodness. Oh. So, what did you, dear scholars, think of the story? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Did you enjoy it? Did you find it just as horrifying? Did you have any issues with the tale? I'm One thing I'm kind of curious about is how much, and I've heard people argue this before. Dr. Zadium, it was very unsettling. Private Maverick, it was a mystery for sure. Some people have argued the question: how much is actually to blame for Helen? How much are these deaths actually put on her hands when it is? It sounds like some of it is basically just her nature, her trying to basically exist as she is in a weird way. Cool Skeleton, I would have to agree with you what you said. Short but creepy. Sadium, it was very unsettling. Julian 20, it was pretty interesting, though it was the best towards the end. It is a slow build. It is a slow build, and the horrors in it aren't like the direct, visceral, jump at you horrors. But reading between the lines, it is a really intense, very story. Very off-putting in some ways story if you read between the lines of what's happened. Again, I can understand in some ways why the critics were a little bit off-put by it. It really was nothing like probably had been written at the time. And it is interesting to note Arthur Munch, and this was not Arthur Munch's only horror story. He wrote several. He especially dabbled in folk horror. And like I said earlier, Julian 20, thank you for giving me nightmares once more. You are very welcome, apparently. Um, as I said earlier, this is almost like a next step in folk horror, in that Pan has figured in other forms of folk horror. I mean, the Music on the Hill, which I read in a collab with Dear F.T. Wastes. Um, uh, by Saki uses Pan as the basis for the folk horror in that story. But with this, they take Pan, who the nominally the god of nature, and they rewrite Pan into almost this eldritch abomination horror thing, and then use that as a jumping off point to tell this tale, which is more about, well, what happens when you take this prime evil base eldritch horror and put it in Victorian society London, which is very controlled, very, very restrictive. And then you see what happens to that, in which in this case is you see another side of Pan, which is its panic, the madness that Pan is supposedly bringing, and Helen Vaughn apparently bring forth this primal, almost in some ways, I almost want to say slightly sexual, um, intense madness to them. This ecstasy that they are experiencing, but they cannot survive. And that's why ultimately they have to destroy her, because she is something so frighteningly primitive to them that she is overwhelming their senses. She is essentially the gateway into this world of the dark, primitive, primeval nature, naturalistic world that society has grown past, but because it's grown past, when it's reintroduced, it threatens it. At least that's how I'm reading it, my dear scholars. Which is, again, something that, as I was repeating 3 times, was something that readers at the time weren't used to. They were used to, of course, the idea of folklore, and there was folklore horror, there was mentions of Pan and stuff like that. But now all of a sudden you have this very intense, base, deprived horror, essentially, infiltrating what they believe is their controlled and safe society. It is horror at its core, but it's a horror that is the prototype for later horrors, such as your Eldritch Abominations, your Lovecraftian horrors, your worlds of beings that are beyond the scope of human understanding, like myself, that sort of thing. And it was something that not a lot of critics at the time really understood. But I enjoyed it. I thought it was Dr. Zadium. I like that notion. Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting story. And I again reading this, I can see why so many horror authors later used the concepts as a jumping off point for their own concepts and kind of developed that idea further. So, my dear scholars, whew, I am out of breath. So this week, Tuesday, we are going to have an extra special Halloween stream. Starting at 7 o'clock Central Time, 8 o'clock Eastern. We're going to have two things we're going to be doing. For the first hour of our stream, we will be reading some folktale scary stories from around the world. The second half, though, we will be moving to the movie room, and we'll be finishing off the night with that, with the very classic silent horror film, The Cat and the Canary. It was the basis for almost every single dark house horror film that came after it, and it is a bit comedic in parts. Silent film, very well shot, and we are going to watch that on the latter half of our Halloween stream. Those will probably be the only streams we'll be doing this week, as that one is going to be our big one for the week. Union 20 sounds like good times. Yes, yes. I'm hoping it will be too. I'm hoping everything goes smoothly. We'll see. For now, let's see who we can raid before we finish off this, close out this evening. Let's see who we got. A lot of choices. You know what? Let's read The Alchemist. We haven't raided her in a while. So for now, my dear scholars, I say unto you, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Till we meet each other again at the study. Take care, and I shall see you next time. Till then, farewell and bye-bye.